Hello, everyone. Hope everybody is well. I am doing okay. Oh my God, this week the weather here in Canada has been ridiculous. On Wednesday, it was extremely hot. Then Thursday and Friday, we were back into what we know as Canadians, cold and freezing. But what can we say? That's not new to us. We adjusted the way we're supposed to, and we're rolling with it. We're tough people in Canada, you know. We go up, we go down. We go through summer, we go through winter. We go through heat, we go through snowstorms and ice and everything. But every day, we as Canadians, no matter where we're from, we buckle up and we roll with it. So that's what we did this week. Let me see. Did anything exciting happen this week? Yes. I've been thinking all week about the interview I'm having today, and my heart was just singing with joy because this woman is on fire, being active, fighting, doing what she has to do to make our world and her indigenous people heard and our world a better place. As you know, this is the Anna Edu Show, and what I've decided to do is to bring you stories that encourage and inspire you to be the best that you can be. And so today's poem is about how you look at life. And here it goes. I always have to put on my glass. It says, the world is how you see it. You're free to choose your sights, to look for love and goodness, or dim your inner lights. The world is how you speak it. You're free to make your choice, to tell your braver story, or punish with your voice. The world is how you feel it. You're free to sense your tribe, tune in to your emotions, or disconnect your vibe. The world is how you dance it. You're free to move your way, to let your passion guide you, or let your fear play. The world is how you taste it. You're free to spice it up, experiment its wonders, or spill your empty cup. The world is how you make it. You're free to build your place, to leave your print of magic, or leave an empty space. And this poem is by Irina Leitis. Why did I choose this poem? Because every day as we go back and forth, as we live our lives, we have a choice to be sad or to be happy, to be joyful or to be fearful. But if we choose the positive side of life, we help ourselves and we help others. So my advice to you, no matter what you're going through, no matter what you're feeling, no matter what is happening in your life, know that there's good on the other side of it and choose to go towards that good. That is why I'm excited and very happy to introduce my guest for today, Pamela she's the chair of Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. I've known her for years, and her power, the power she brings, as some people will say, she holds no prisoners. She tells it like it is. And I know it is because her soul is here to serve humanity, especially her people. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome Dr. Pamela Palmater. Hello.
Hi, Anna. Thanks for having me back. I miss you so much.
I miss you. I miss your calm energy. I miss the way you tell it like it is. And you know, it's amazing how you come across somebody, and some way, somehow they fill your soul. You see, because in life, we all need somebody who fills our soul and somebody who perks us up. And to be honest with you, you're one of those for me.
Well, thank you. And I feel the same about you because you have a way of turning everything into a positive. Even the most difficult, we can find ways around it and, create something positive for the future. So, that helps fill people up like me who are working on the front lines.
Yes.
And it's very challenging every day. We need that, strength that comes from positivity.
Amen. We do need it. How did you find that poem? I was so happy when I came across it.
Yeah, well, I thought the poem was really beautiful. And as you were reading it, I was thinking, that's literally the dream. Wouldn't it be wonderful if Black and Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island could actually have that dream to choose the path they wanted, to live the way they wanted, to have all of the good life that they wanted without the state, without society trying to impose barriers, trying to keep people down and, treating them in such deplorable ways. I think we don't want anything different than anybody else, just to live the good life the way we want to.
And it's quite very, very simple, but I don't know why it's difficult. But I guess as we all continue to do what we do, and I don't like people who talk and do nothing.
Yes.
Right? Like you're talking. Whilst you're talking, the person who's oppressing you is busy doing what they have to do. And you're just sitting there talking. But before you and I get going, you know how we do. Tell us about yourself and the work you do and why you do it.
Well, thanks for this opportunity. Pamela Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation, an unceded Mi'kmaqi territory. My home community is Ugbaganjig, which is known as Eel River Bar First Nation. I come from a huge family of 8 sisters and 3 brothers. Most of whom were a lot older than me, and so we're very much engaged on the ground in the grassroots and community level in terms of activism and defending and asserting our rights. So my childhood was literally comprised of being dragged around to community meetings, protests, marches, rallies, debates, negotiations with government. So my education started really early. And so, from there and keeping going on with that, I also, did university work. I have my doctorate in law. I've been a practicing lawyer for 23 years now, focusing on Indigenous laws that impact Indigenous peoples, and of course, human rights, which involve, all of our other communities. And I'm currently the chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson, which focuses on community-based work. So the kind of research that isn't for the sake of textbooks, while that's important, and it's not just about teaching who has the benefit to go to university, but it's reaching out to the public, doing massive public education, engaging with communities on the ground, doing research that has real impact and value for advocacy, for litigation, for making change. And I think that's one of the ways in which universities can make contributions instead of just teaching those who are privileged enough to go to university. We need to get into the communities and provide the kinds of work they need.
Oh my God, I need more friend lawyers.
Some people don't think so much, but
Why am I saying that? I'm saying that because this week you're the second lawyer I've spoken to who's talked about why everything textbook without it affecting the person on the ground. How is that person, even sometimes the words in those textbooks don't mean anything to the person. You've written it, you brought somebody in as a speaker, and yet the person on the street, the person on the ground who needs what is in the textbook is not getting it. And I like that I'm hearing that. I like being surrounded by people such as yourselves, because then it lets me know that I'm on the right path. So I really, really, really want, so for many of us who come from other places and settle in Canada, we don't really know the story, right? So when they say Indigenous people, we're like, okay, and then we go on, right? So I want you to please explain what they mean by Indigenous people, so that whoever is watching this show can understand the background, right? Because, we live in our communities here and there, and unless we come across somebody like you, or there's a problem in the indigenous community. Nobody hears about the indigenous community. So my hope is that working with you and chatting with you more and more, I will be part of the education that others need. So please explain what this means.
Okay, so in very simple terms, we're talking about the original peoples of this territory. So the people who have been here since time immemorial. Now, archaeologists have tried to date us, said, oh, we've been here 5,000 years, 10,000 years. Now it's 20,000 years. So we don't pay attention to that. We're talking about we have been here on this territory. We were the first. We originated here. So when we say Indigenous peoples, it's a generic term to refer to different groups. So you've got First Nations, who used to be referred to as Indians. First Nations are the native peoples that lived here. So the Cree people, the Mi'kmaq, the Haudenosaunee, we're talking about large nations of people that occupied vast territories. And then you have the Inuit in the north. Who live in Canada's Arctic, who live in Alaska, who live in the circumpolar region of the planet, in fact, and they have their own histories and their own cultures and own languages. And then you have, after settlement, you have a group called Métis, the Métis Nation, that developed over time between the unions between Europeans and some First Nations groups, but they ended up living as a separate nation with their own laws and their own customs and they even developed their own language of Michif. So generally there's those three different groups, but it's important for people to remember that within the group of First Nations, we're not just one big homogenous group. We are literally between 50 and 60 separate nations with different laws, different cultures, different languages, and different territories. So although we use the term Indigenous, to mean all of them, it's important to remember that there's a lot of distinctions within that term alone.
That is a lot to, so these are all right here in Canada.
Yes.
And because what I'm hearing is that for somebody who doesn't read, or somebody who, is so poor and is busy minding their own business, they really don't know. We really don't know much about the Indigenous people or all these communities, languages, cultures that you mentioned. But today I want us to focus on one particular thing that I just don't understand it. I don't understand it. And that is why I thought about you again and said, let's bring her back. And now let's not only bring her back, but figure out how we can work together to put the message out there to educate people. And it's about the missing and murdered Aboriginal women, right? Like, I don't understand. What has happened. How did we get to a place where, we all know women suffer a lot in society, in silence, and all of that. But how did we come to the place where this story of murdered Indigenous missing women gets so bad? I'm always very I don't know. I don't understand it.
So, well, I'm really glad you asked that question, because a lot of people don't understand the history. This isn't something that just developed over time. This is something that was intentional. So prior to contact, remember I was talking about the different, First Nations around Cree, Mi'kmaq. All of our different nations had different forms of leadership, but they all respected that Indigenous women played a very significant role. Sometimes we were the leaders, sometimes we were the political strategists, the negotiators, the traders. We were also raising children. So we had very important and powerful voices over what happened in our territories, what kinds of agreements we made. And so when settlers came and the colonial governments came and they wanted to take all of our lands and resources and somehow ensure the elimination or extinction of Indians, they wanted to quote unquote get rid of the Indian problem. They thought they would target Native women because they were so powerful. They were literally the heart of our nations, not better or less than the men in our nations, but we had very powerful roles. So they targeted us right away from the very beginning. They legislated the Indian Act, which removed us from any ability to hold a position of power. We couldn't be part of our governments. We couldn't exercise our voices. We were effectively cut out of any decision making, and that was imposed by the Indian Act. They engaged in massive campaigns of forced sterilizations and forced abortions so that we couldn't keep up our populations. They engaged in stealing our children, putting them into residential schools where, many people now know where we were often sexually, physically abused, murdered, neglected, again, forced abortions. So we're talking about very gendered forms of colonization that targeted Indigenous women. We were also excluded from even being members of our community. So the Indian Act targeted First Nation women and children for exclusion from the Indian Act with a view to us being legislatively eliminated over time. And so you're talking about multiple generations. There's literally hundreds of thousands of women and children that are still excluded from their communities because of this sexist and racist Indian Act. So if that's the way in which you construct your country and you construct your relationship with Indigenous nations, then of course you're going to create a system where all of your laws, policies, and practices serve to eliminate, neglect, discriminate against, oppress, dispossess, and exploit Indigenous women and girls. So from the very early days of contact, the Northwest Mounted Police would withhold food rations in order to extort sex from young First Nation girls. And now you have this sexualized violence built right into Canada as a country where Indigenous women and girls throughout history up to and including today have been sexually abused and exploited and traded by police officers, corrections officers, social workers, doctors and nurses, parole officers,
so
name
what
it.
you're saying is that they practically turned these women into sex objects.
Yes, to be exploited and then considered expendable. So think about, people ask, well, why weren't police following up on missing Indigenous women? Why weren't they following up on all these murders? Why are Indigenous women and girls the number one targets of human traffickers and serial killers? It's because Canada has created a country that doesn't care about the life, safety, and well-being of Indigenous women and girls. And that is the number one root cause of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls today in this country. And it is going to take a massive effort to undo that complex weave of laws, policies, and governing practices to stop that.
So you being the chair of Indigenous governance, this is taking you deep into the history of the Indigenous people and also giving you the power to enact other laws that will work on their behalf. Am I correct?
Well, what I do is try to do the research and analysis so that we can propose evidence-based solutions to really try to change laws, but also policies and practices. And I do that here, before Parliament and Senate. I'm constantly speaking about laws that hurt us, laws that we should have, but also at the United Nations and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. All of those human rights treaty bodies at the international level serve a very important role in pushing states to uphold their basic human rights obligations, which have been denied to us. So we use a multitude of forums, legislation here in Canada, at the international level, pressure, litigation, advocacy on the streets, and very importantly is this kind of public education where we help educate people and not just for entertainment or information purposes, but education for action. Once you know better, what steps are you going to take to stop this from happening? Because we can't just look to the government. We often think of government as this entity that's responsible for everything. Well, who do you think works for the government? It's Canadians. It's your brother. It's your sister. It's your community. It's your next door neighbor. So we are all implicated in helping to end this change or, force this change.
So one of the things I know is that whenever there's an issue that has gone on for years, we have to keep looking at ourselves, but also we have to look at the next generation coming up so that they understand their history. Because once your history is forgotten, you're flailing around like a fish in water, right? So my question is, because I'm always thinking about, okay, so how are we going to solve this? What is the next step? Who are the leaders coming up? Is the community, because I believe that if each community is going to succeed, that community has to play a vital role in their own story. So, for example, I continue to do the Anna Edu show, hopefully to be a voice, to open a door for people to come and tell their story. And as I stand, hopefully another young girl or boy will see me and say, oh, look at Anna, she's standing, I can stand too. So my question to you is, are young people in the indigenous community being educated, right? Are they being educated? Because when we leave the next generation behind, we'll only be repeating our story. So my thing is, you're there, you're standing. I see a lot of you, right? But that's because I know you. Maybe there are other people who do the same work. But my question is, are there many other people? And also, are the younger ones being educated, being enlightened? I'm not just talking about classroom education. I'm talking about enlightenment, grassroots, steps to take to make things better for the indigenous people.
Yes. The categoric answer to that is yes. And that's what gives me the hope and inspiration to continue. If I was looking around and seeing that we weren't taking steps, we weren't educating ourselves, we weren't bringing along the next generation, it would be very discouraging. But I actually have the most amount of hope, not in government, because they don't do anything unless they're forced to. My hope is in the people. And the advent of social media has also helped us reach younger and younger age groups that we couldn't necessarily before. So the reason why I'm involved in this is because my family made sure I got a traditional Mi'kmaq education in terms of, hunting and fishing and all of the cultural values, but at the same time, our political responsibilities and obligations to our nation. So that's what we're participating in, community education. And so I did that for my kids. And you can see each generation is getting more and more powerful, more and more education, and taking control over the decolonization process. Because if we wait for government to do it, well, we know they're not going to do it. I mean, we had a report from the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls 2 years ago that found Canada guilty of genocide. Do we have a plan to end it? No. So we take that into our own hands, and we have community grassroots individuals and organizations that are providing supports to communities, and education is literally the key. Education in terms of our own cultural education, but education in terms of formal education and what's happening in the bigger political and legal realm.
Right. I like that you mentioned cultural education, because what I find is that for, all of us have come from somewhere, at least from my perspective and from mine, except for indigenous people and all of that. But my question is, are we maintaining the culture? Are indigenous peoples maintaining the culture? Because I find that when we lose our culture, we lose ourselves, because that is what differentiates you from the other person. And there is nothing wrong with having your culture. It doesn't mean you're against somebody, but that is what identifies you for who you are. So is the indigenous culture, the languages, the people, the style, is it being maintained? Is it being maintained?
So here's, a significant challenge. Part of 500 years of genocide, colonization, and violent oppression and dispossession, Canada has worked very hard through things like residential schools, in foster care, the Indian Act, to outlaw our culture and identity. I mean, our ceremonies were outlawed in the Indian Act. At residential schools, you could be beaten or lose your life for speaking your language. So there has been a significant amount of damage done to our language and culture over, you think of a multitude of generations. So we are in a two-part process right now, resisting ongoing genocide and destruction of our culture, but also cultural revitalization and language revitalization. We are doing our very best with no resources to maintain our languages because, in fact, 97% of all of our different Indigenous languages are in danger of extinction in the near future. Only 3 are relatively safe from immediate extinction, and that is because of Canada's laws, policies, and practices. The other thing is really relates to things like funding. Billions of dollars are put into preserving the French language in Canada as if it's one of the 2 founding languages. And that completely ignores the 50 different Indigenous languages in this country that are the original languages. And so we face a significant amount of challenge, but we're divided between this resistance and resurgence and trying to make sure we're balancing our efforts, because to us, our culture and our identity and our language and everything is tied to our land. It's tied to our ancestors. It's tied to our well-being and how we want to live in the future.
You know how before Black history wasn't taught in school, right? So your child could go to school here in Canada and never read about their own story, right? But the Indigenous languages, which is part of Canada, is it being taught at all anywhere? Is it even talked about? Right? Because like I said, unless I'm talking to you, or unless yesterday I saw a news article about children, a mass grave of children. That's another story. We'll be talking about that another day, because then I was like, oh, there's more conversation to be had with Pam. But going back to the languages, right? Because I find we, even as Africans, have so many languages, right? We have so many languages, but at the end of the day, we all end up speaking English mostly to each other, right? So what I want to understand, and maybe our guests to also understand this, are the languages even spoken about in schools across the board, the Indigenous languages?
Well, I'm really glad you raised, the mass grave of those 215 children from the residential school in BC, because that is what genocide looks like in this country. And children often lost their lives for speaking their language. They suffered horrific abuse just for speaking their language. So for many, many, generations, of course, our languages weren't taught in Canadian schools, and we had to hide our own languages and try to pass them on. Now there's a cultural revitalization. So of the First Nations that have schools on reserve, because not all of them do, but of those that have schools on reserve, they're trying to incorporate language instruction into their schools. Some of them are trying very hard to have immersion in their own languages, but this is very difficult because both the federal government and provincial government demand that provincial criteria be applied to First Nation schools on reserves, which doesn't prioritize Indigenous languages and cultures. Now, in terms of schools off reserve in the general publication, I never had the benefit of language instruction. My kids never had that benefit. And there might be some, like a language course that's offered here and there in certain schools, but certainly you don't see immersion in the local languages. Like, for example, in Nova Scotia, there's only one Indigenous group there. It's the Mi'kmaq Nation, my nation. So there's no reason why the Mi'kmaq language could not be another official language of Nova Scotia, taught in schools like French and English, but they haven't taken those steps yet. So those are the kinds of things that we're pushing for, official language status, because that comes along with legal protections, funding, and the protection of our language from being eliminated, because it means a lot to us.
Yes, because I know that when I speak my language, I flourish. I know. And my daughters, of course, they grew up in Canada here. The school system is English. we speak the language, but they cannot pick it up because from school and their friends, they're all speaking English. But I love it when they attempt to speak the language. I love it when they use the words like to say thank you. When I see that they're trying, it means they're hungry for their language. So we have to do the best we can for our languages because history is important to the sustenance of every community. Now, so who enacted that Indian Act that took away so much from Indigenous people?
So that was the federal government. So when the federal and provincial politicians all got together, you know, these colonial governments, and they decided to create Canada on our territories without consulting us, and they created, you know, the Constitution Act of 1867, the federal and provincial governments divided jurisdiction over certain areas amongst themselves. The federal government reserved for itself jurisdiction over what they called Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. And shortly thereafter, in 1876, they took all the bits and pieces of legislation that they had enacted before Canada was a country and created the Indian Act. And we still have the Indian Act, and it has stayed pretty much the same since its inception. It's federal control over our communities. They imposed a certain form of governance over our traditional forms of governance. They excluded women, excluded children. They included extinction dates. I mean, literally, they control our wills, our estates. They control our monies. I mean, it's literally this act that controls our life from birth until death. And I should tell people that this only applies to Indians or First Nations people. The Indian Act does not apply to Inuit people in the north, nor does it apply to the Métis who came much later after settlement.
So this applies to a particular group of people.
Yes.
So in other words, what you're saying, if I can break it down, is that it sort of took away the human, because today I wanted to highlight the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women, because once you do all that to a woman or to a human being, what you do is take away who they are, so that they walk around marching to your beat, to whatever you say or whatever you do. Am I right?
Yes. I mean, that you literally hit the nail on the head. The National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls found that the sex discrimination and the exclusion of women and children from being members of their community or having a voice in their community is a direct root cause of all of society's sex and race-based discrimination towards Indigenous women and girls today that leads to the high rates of violence, abuse, and exploitation. A direct root cause. Canada has the power to change that act tomorrow, but we are still fighting them in multiple court cases to end sex discrimination and race discrimination in the Indian Act, especially towards Indigenous women and girls, and they fight us every step of the way. We win every case, but we continue to have to fight them to implement and to end all sex discrimination. It's incredible things that Canadians don't know that their own governments are engaged in.
And that is what I am curious about, because when you sexualize girls from when they're little, it has a very serious effect on their minds, their humanity. And unless things are like they're pulled and held, the shame, the guilt, the fear, they're not feeling good about themselves, continue to live on in their lives. So my thing is, when Indigenous women and girls want to go to university, do they get a break? Is it free, or do they have to pay the money?
Well, you know, there's a whole bunch of background to that. So many First Nations signed treaties with the Crown, so the British Crown, and part of those treaty promises were not only a recognition of our independence and rights, but also a promise to pay for education at all levels. So whether it's early childhood education, K to 12, or post-secondary. So that's a treaty right that Indigenous people, that First Nations have. Now, what the federal government has done is set aside a small amount of money that they only dole out for a small amount of people, to the extent that we find in the demographic studies that Canada funds less First Nations people to go to university today than they did 30 years ago. We've had upwards of 15,000 people sitting on waiting lists just to get partial support. And if you compare that to the amount of scholarships, bursaries, and free grants that are given to non-Indigenous peoples, you see that Indigenous peoples get far less than non-Indigenous peoples do, despite the fact that we have a treaty right to this education that's protected in the Constitution. Canada violates those treaty rights, and we've continued to try to raise that. Governments have promised to stop discriminating and provide more support for education, but they don't do that. We've made the case that, listen, educated women are far less likely to die in childbirth. Educated women are far less likely to have children that die in early ages. They're far more likely to be able to support themselves. They're far less likely to suffer from violence and abuse. That education can be so powerful, but they make conscious choices not to do that. So the violence and the dispossession and the loss of life comes directly because of their policy decisions.
And my thing is, so we're talking about women and we're talking about policies and things like that. Is there anybody out there informing these young girls and women that have gone through all this sexual violence, sexual abuse, mental and emotional and all that? Are there people out there letting them understand that what they have endured shouldn't have control over them, that they should rise up and fight systems for their place in society? Because one of the things I'm sort of tired of is women waiting till they're 50 and over, having suffered throughout their lives from sexual violence, sexual abuse, and then at 50 or 60, they're now talking about it, when they could have done something to encourage them to move forward. So my question is, are there people out there telling these women in the indigenous community that this is something that happened to you? It is not you. And are they being empowered to stand up and speak for themselves? Because everybody can talk, but they need to speak up. Am I right?
So we have a very delicate situation in our context where we're not talking about historical trauma. We're talking about the kind of trauma that gets repeated over and over and over and over again. And sometimes just the act of speaking out can put you at higher risk for violence.
Right.
We've got RCMP officers, we've got CSIS, we've got the military, we've got all law enforcement who have put people who are engaged in peaceful advocacy on terror watch lists. They often brutalize us, they incarcerate us, they take away our children if we speak out, if we engage in acts of resistance or try to empower ourselves. So we have a very unique situation here where we have to balance providing the healing and support of children and women who have been traumatized over and over and over again, with making sure that they are safe in their ability to speak out. So we never go into a community and say, you should do X, Y, and Z if that's not safe for them, knowing that all of the structures in society are set against Indigenous women and girls, that we don't live in the kind of society where it's just a matter of empowering yourself. It's a matter of, you've got police officers that are sexually violating and abusing and injuring Indigenous women and girls, so you can't call the police. You often get a domestic abuse situation where, what do? Well, you're going to get violence from your partner, or do you call the police and also get violent?
Oh, yeah.
So it's a very unique and sensitive situation where we have to balance safety with healing and empowerment. And yes, to answer your question, there are many individuals and grassroots organizations, community groups, and others, Indigenous women organizations, working with women and children and trying to do this delicate balance of healing, empowerment, but also safety. Because for example, because of my advocacy, one of the, right-wing media organizations labeled me as the top 5 to fear in Canada. and, made videos of me saying that I was a traitor and dangerous. They showed a map
Really?
to my house. And so imagine if someone took that seriously, a viewer, and then came to my house and actually was violent. So there's a lot of safety issues that we have to take into account in addition to the healing and empowerment.
Wow, you're dealing with a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're dealing with a lot, and but you're fearless, and that's all that matters to me. So, what can anybody that is listening? I know, because my thing is, when I interview somebody, I want people to take something away from it, no matter where they are. I want them to maybe look at their circumstance, listen to what the viewer said and what I said, and see what they can apply to their own lives. So let's say there's a young girl, not only from the Indigenous community, that is suffering much abuse and is struggling. What are some of the steps they can take? They may not be able to speak about it, but what are some of the steps they can take so that it doesn't weigh on them, so that they can live their life fully without, you know how sometimes you go into hiding because something happened to you. What can that young girl do? How can you and I, as grown women, support that young girl and lift her up? How can we do it?
Well, I think there's two parts to that question. One are, the young people, especially these young girls in situations. First and foremost, it's always about your immediate health, safety, and well-being. So sometimes that means not doing anything and surviving until the next day. And that's okay. Surviving to live another day is what warriors do. But sometimes you might be in a position where you have access to external help, external resources. It could be elders, it could be family members, it could be counselors. And so for those who are in a position where they're safe to do so, reaching out and getting that help, even if you don't know what kind of help you need, can often be the first step to people intervening and assisting you.
Right.
But so it's always, again, like I said, this balance between safety and health, and to know that even if you don't see us, even if you don't hear us, even if you don't know what's coming the next day, know that there are people on the outside that are fighting on your behalf, and that will be there when we're able to connect. Now, that's a different conversation from what Canadians can do to support in these situations. Now, Canadians, to me, have a legal and a moral obligation to be intentional about the territories on which they sit, which are not theirs. They belong to Indigenous peoples. So know about your local Indigenous nation, the territory on which you sit, and then identify all of the ways in which you can contribute in some way. So some people have resources and they can provide funding to local groups. Some people have research skills and can offer those research skills to an organization. Other people may not have that, but they might be communications specialists, IT specialists, or they might be in a sphere of influence where they can advocate for change. Maybe they sit on a school board. Maybe they're an MP. Maybe they're a senator. Maybe they, are the head of nursing at a hospital where they can help lead the change. And then there's lots of other ways. I mean, they could take this video, share it widely, use it in their classrooms, send it to their local representatives and say, listen, you need to take action on these things. They can, write about it. They can speak about it. They can make sure that it is never lost in the Canadian conversation, in the media, in schools, in businesses, in workplaces, in hospitals, in government, until we get the change that we need. But there isn't anybody who doesn't have something to offer, to some action that they can take. And I know it's often underrated, the impact of emails to politicians or petitions and things like that, but they actually do make a difference. More than once, I have gone before a parliamentary committee and they've said, well, no Canadians seem to be upset about this. We don't have any letters. We don't have any petitions. Well, you know what? It doesn't take much to sign a template email or a petition, but that can make a huge difference in terms of forcing change. What I don't want people to happen is listen, learn, and say, well, that was interesting.
Yes, and that's my whole thing. That is my whole thing about we seem to go round and round in circles. Yeah, yeah. Oh, what a shame. And then that's where it's left. So
Yeah.
the other conversation, the other thing that's been it's been in the back of my mind. You know, we talk a lot about women's empowerment, and the girls went through this, and the girls went through that. Often we tend to leave out the boys and the men.
Yes.
But this story of sexual violence, abuse, and all that, it takes two people. So, what are we as a society doing to educate our boys and our men for them to understand that raping a woman, just having sex with a woman for your pleasure, does damage to her? How how do we do that? Because we can't keep empowering just the girls. We can't keep empowering the women without addressing it with the men for them to understand the depth. Am I wrong? Tell me.
No, I mean, if you look at the amount of violence that is both sexualized violence and, brutalizations or killings to men and to women, it comes for the most part from men. So we're talking not just about violence in the air, we're talking about male sexualized violence, male brutalization, male killings of women in general, but specifically Indigenous women. But here's the different situation in the Indigenous community. The vast majority of violence and exploitation and killings of Indigenous women and girls doesn't come from our communities. There's a small part. Domestic violence is always part of it, but the majority are people in state institutions, in society, non-Indigenous people. So we're having two conversations here. We're talking about men, Indigenous men who have been brutalized by the same colonial system, have suffered the same and sometimes in different ways, and how they have reacted or re-perpetuated that trauma. And yes, we work with our men on that. But then there's the biggest factor, which is all of the violence that comes from state institutions and Canadian society. And that's not something we can teach our people out of. That comes from society. And society has a big role to play in saying that you can't do that to Indigenous peoples, you can't do that to Black peoples, you can't treat women this way, you can't treat Indigenous women that way. And for us, that's our biggest hurdle, really, about denormalizing violence and sexualized violence towards Indigenous women and girls that's in society. I mean, you only need to look at your local Halloween shop and you see a polka hottie outfit which sexualizes what they think Indigenous women and girls look like. And that perpetuates this idea that we're just sexual objects that can be thrown away afterwards. And so we've really got to dig deep in society for them to change their own ideas about us.
So as you continue to work on behalf of Indigenous peoples, you're also working on behalf of women. As I said, when you stand strong, when I stand strong, another woman can stand strong, right? So in your role as chair of Indigenous governance, do you find that you're affecting a lot of the young girls that are coming through your hands and all that? Do you find encouragement just knowing that some of the girls are getting stronger because you're there?
Yes, exactly. And I think you raise a really good point, because if we were left to do this all by ourselves, the situation would be even more monumental. But what we've done in recent decades is come together. So we had Indigenous peoples coming together with Black Lives Matter, with Stop Asian Hate, with women's groups, anti-poverty groups, environmental groups, to say, look, there is human and planetary injustice happening here. Look at all of our successes in our advocacy in our individual groups. Imagine if we put all of that power together and worked as a force while respecting our differences. Our suffering is not the same. Our trauma is not the same. It doesn't originate from the same place. The solutions that we want aren't the same. but that's okay. What is the same is our pursuit of human rights and environmental justice to save the planet. And we can all get around safety for women and children and people in general and the planet, and respect our differences. And it's okay. We all have different cultures and different backgrounds, and that's what makes us stronger. And so that's my big call to Canadians. Be a part of that. Don't just leave it to Black Lives Matter or women's groups or Indigenous people. Be a part of that change, because someday you're going to need it. And boy, you want to have us have your back.
What can I say? That's a powerful note to end on, but we're only ending on it today. You and I will be talking and addressing other issues along the way. So keep on keeping on. I'm watching you. You've been in my radar, and I'm learning also from you. So my dear, thank you so much for all this information. I don't think we've gotten enough, but time is up. But I know that we will get together and do more work on the show as well as in various communities. So I wish you well. I wish you power. Continue to dance on LinkedIn. I watch your videos. Stay blessed.
Thank you so much. And you know, my heart beats with yours, and I'm so glad that we're sisters moving forward in this mission.
Amen. So you take care and all the best. Thanks for fighting. Thanks for fighting for all of us. Bye-bye. So, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've all learned something from our woman today. If you're a woman out there, nobody is saying go out and beat anybody. All we're saying is go out and do your part so that humanity can get better. Thank you. It's the Anna Edu Show, and our guest today is Dr. Pamela Palmater, Chair of Indigenous Governance from Ryerson University. Stay blessed. Bye-bye. Love.
TV.